Have you ever wondered what you're worth? I mean, your true value, not your income or maybe even your investments. I know it's an odd question, and maybe one you haven't really thought of. But maybe you've asked a question, maybe in your mind or in your heart, of where do I fit in? What's my purpose in the great cosmos? You know, if you asked what you were worth to a loved one, they might say something like, "You're priceless." And they'd be right. I mean, who could put a price tag on a person? Kind of crazy. Have you ever wondered this maybe? What does God think you're worth? Now, you might not believe in God or religion or any of this, and that's fine, but just for a second, jump into this question with me. What would God say you're worth? What would it matter? How would you know? I mean, could it affect your life? Before we dive into that, let's talk about this God for a second, because the idea of God is a pretty big one. I think most of us have a concept of what we think God is or isn't, and sometimes we say, well, if there is a God, they should do this or they should do that, or we might say there can't be a God because how could God let this happen? Or maybe you've heard someone say that's who God is to you, but not to me. Kind of an odd concept if you really think about it. Like our opinions would matter if this really is a God that created everything, a supreme God of the universe, then would our opinions really affect who God is? If I came up to you and said, I don't believe you exist, would that change who you are? Or if I said, you can't be real because you don't act in line with what I think you should be acting like, that wouldn't have any effect on who you were at all. So how do we think that our opinions could affect who God is? Here's another thought. If this God, if this creator of all things, the God who created the entire earth, every person, planet, rock, every star in the sky, everything in all of creation, which is mind-boggling to try and even understand, why would we matter to God at all? Why, in the midst of all of creation, would we think we're valuable to this God? Now, we're valuable to the people we know, our loved ones. We think we matter to them. There's a book in the Bible called Psalms, and in Psalms 8, verse 4, the author asks this question: what is man that you are mindful of them? What are human beings that you care about them at all? The author assumes that God does care about us, but is kind of overwhelmed because God is so great. In comparison, we're so small. So let's go back to that first question. What are you worth? If anyone could answer that question, wouldn't it be God? As creator, God would have a unique perspective on the question. As God, he would have an unbiased and unselfish motive in answering the question. And let's face it, the answer to any question is only as good and as credible as the source the answer comes from. I think God answers this question in the most famous verse of the Bible, in John 3:16. Now, you might have seen it at a football game, or you think Tim Tebow wrote it, but it says this, that God loved the entire earth so much that he sent his son, that whoever believed in his son wouldn't perish, but have eternal life. The next verse kind of expands on this idea. It says that God didn't send his son Jesus to the earth to condemn the earth, but that the earth might be saved through him. It's a crazy concept. It actually means that God valued you so much that he put a price tag on you. He put a price tag on all of us and said, you are worth my son. Is there anyone in your life that you would die for? I mean, is there anyone that you would say their life is more valuable than mine? Is there anyone in your life that you would sacrifice your child for? That's a much harder question, but that's what God did for us. God said, you were worth my son. See, God has impossibly high standards. God wasn't looking for good people. God was looking for perfect people, and none of us could do it. So he sent his son, who was perfect, to actually carry the burden of perfection for all humanity, and then the penalty for our imperfection. Now, before we get caught up in what is sin or isn't sin and who's a good person compared to a bad person, let's think about that overwhelming gesture on God's behalf. God didn't just say he loved you, he showed it. God didn't just say that you were valuable, he put a price on us, and it was his son. God sent Jesus, who died a horrific death, and God was okay with it. He actually was able to wipe out all the stuff that was between us and God so that we could know him. Let that sink in for a moment. No matter what you believe or don't believe about God, that's what God believes about you. God believes you're worth it. He believes you're worth his son, who died so that you could know God. Maybe Jesus is not about religion and rules, but an opportunity to know a loving God. I think that a God who calls me worth it is worth exploring.